Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Flying and Eating. Today, let's go somewhere and do something, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey guys, it's Adam here. On today's adventure, I am here at the White House in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, to discuss the infamous Abraham Lincoln assassination. Believe it or not, this is going to be the 160th anniversary of the event, so I thought it would be interesting to revisit it in totality by going to all the relevant sites, not only here, but around the rest of the country. We'll tell the story in linear order and give any additional facts and interesting points as we go. Welcome to a very special episode of Flying and Eating with no flying, no eating, and a lot of editing. Our story begins in the crucible of the Civil War, a political and ideological divide between the northern and southern states over the concept of the American Union. From the southern perspective, the Union was a marriage of convenience that existed for the purposes of aiding their ends, something they believed they had the right to exit when it was no longer conducive to their goals. The North maintained, correctly so, that the Union represented the very idea of the democratic experiment. The experiment had been new in global history, the idea of a society by the people, of the people, and for the people that gave unto its citizens the inalienable right to prosperity with enough work and effort. This construct was the Union, all for one and one for all. Thus you could not simply exit it for disagreeing with it, lest you'd be a traitor. Abraham Lincoln held these views to be self-evident, seeing his own rise to success and power from nothing in the rural farms of Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, only itself attainable due to the unique nature of the American experiment, i.e. the Union. The very core issue central to this divide was the concept of slavery. Northern states had long since outlawed the practice, while the South continued to propagate it and even wished to expand it further. It was felt that this practice was not only barbaric and immoral, but it was also antithetical to the very nature of the Union. How can a nation proclaim to offer total freedom and the right to climb up the ranks of power and society while simultaneously outlawing a substantial portion of the population from being part of that exact concept? To disband the Union, Lincoln concluded correctly, was not only illegal, it was immoral and intolerable. To this end, the American Civil War, a violent clash between Northern Union forces and Southern Confederate forces, raged from 1861 to 1865. The war beginning when the South fired the first shot on Fort Sumter here in South Carolina, and ultimately concluding in April of 1865 with the surrender of Confederate forces, though technically would carry on until May 26, 1865, due to poor communication and a general disagreement on the idea of surrender. Here at Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois, it must be understood that despite Lincoln's image now as possibly the greatest president in American history, he was not all that well liked in his time. He'd often bypass or creatively circumvent the law to what he saw as necessary ends. His reasons for carrying on with the war instead of tolerating the South's desire to exit the Union, not to mention his views on slavery and the rights of African Americans, caused him a lot of domestic issues. For example, in August of 1864, while Lincoln rode on his way to what is now known as the Lincoln Cottage here behind me, a would-be sniper took aim and fired on the president. He missed, striking a hole through Lincoln's top hat. The president would largely play this off as a joke, an accident, a minor thing, while former First Lady Mary Lincoln found this horrifying. By then, the woman had lost 2 of her sons to sickness, and her sanity was starting to fade. She would go on so far as to claim she believed the president would be shot. Abraham may have downplayed things to keep her calm, but unfortunately for history, he opted not to increase his own security at that time.
In November of 1864, Abraham Lincoln wins re-election. However, his second term is not set to begin until March 4th, 1865. The gap in between is known as the lame duck session. This means everyone who lost is still in power despite knowing they're leaving, while those who won are not yet sworn in. At this point, it was obvious the South would lose the war, but as they had not yet rejoined the Union, they could not vote to block American legislation. Lincoln saw a political opportunity to push forward the 13th Amendment that would result in the total abolition of slavery. It would ultimately pass on January 31st, 1865. While the South attempted to rejoin the Union faster to block the passage, this would not be tolerated. Lincoln understood that slavery at the core had caused the conflict. Were it not eradicated from the American fabric like a tumor to the human body, it would simply grow again and again, causing more death for future generations to deal with. No longer was the goal merely to preserve the old way of American life. Rather, it was to bring forward a new, reborn United States where truly all men were created equal. As a result, the war would carry on for a few more months before Robert E. Lee would surrender the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse here behind me on April 9th, 1865. From this point, it was a mere matter of formality to conclude the war. While this is fascinating and the wider tale of the American Civil War is quite interesting, we're going to focus specifically on the Lincoln assassination. March 4th, 1865, Lincoln is sworn in for the start of his second term and gives his second inaugural address. Unbeknownst to the president, his future assassin, one John Wilkes Booth, was in attendance. Booth, who once lived here at Tudor Hall, was an utterly insane and completely fascinating character. He was a famous actor known nationally. He was even admired by Lincoln himself for his talents. Booth, however, was no fan of the 16th President of the United States. After the inaugural speech, Booth would write in his diary, "What an excellent chance I had, if I wished, to kill the President on Inauguration Day."
Booth perceived Lincoln as a Caesar-like dictator, out to destroy the very fabric of society. He believed he alone had the ability, nay, the duty, to destroy the oppressor. Booth was, of course, a fool.
The presidency was seen more as a job, less of a position of power. Expecting an American president to get attacked or kidnapped would be as weird as someone assaulting the manager of a department store simply because they were in fact the manager. Though I suppose this would make John Wilkes Booth the ultimate Karen.
On January 30th, 1835, there had been a failed assassination attempt on then-President Andrew Jackson, buried here behind me. But this incident, and others prior to Lincoln's own, were not enough to change the social norms. Here at what once was the Surratt House, now something called the Walk and Roll Restaurant, initially Booth didn't intend to simply kill the president. Rather, he wanted to use him for political gains. To that end, he developed a plot to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for Confederate prisoners. Doing so, he felt, would give the South a better fighting chance to endure the war. For this, he recruited a laundry list of unsavory characters to aid in his heinous plot. Samuel Arnold, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Michael O'Laughlin, Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne, John Surratt, and his mother Mary Surratt. This location is where they plotted the coming events. What's particularly fascinating about this is that few of them had any particular distaste for Lincoln. They were simply enamored with Booth. Try to understand that this guy was basically the Tom Cruise of his day. The plan was set for March 17th. The idea was that Lincoln would be attending a play at this site, which was once the General Campbell Hospital and is now just somebody's house. Upon seeing him, the men would manage to abduct him. It must be understood that the secret service as we think of it now simply didn't exist at the time. Presidents rarely had much in the way of security. This plot failed for amusing reasons. Lincoln simply didn't end up attending the play, instead opting to be at a ceremony at the National Hotel, which is now a place called the Capitol Grill. This is ironic as Booth had actually lived at the National Hotel at that time, and thus would have actually had the opportunity that evening if he just hadn't left at all. On April 3rd, 1865, Richmond, Virginia, represented here by its Capitol building, fell to Northern forces, and only a few days later, on April 9th, Lee would surrender to Grant. On April 11th, Lincoln would make his final public speech in which he calls for peaceful reunification with the southern states and to grant the vote to certain African-American members. Booth again was in attendance and was enraged at this very notion. In his mind, something had to be done as soon as possible. It is now April 13th, 1865, the day before the assassination. For the South, the war effort is crumbling. Mobile, Alabama falls to Union forces. Rebels are surrendering en masse, with most Confederate generals agreeing the end is near. Despite this, massive swaths of territory from Florida to Texas remain in rebel hands, but unless you were delusional, you couldn't hope to believe the tide could actually be turned. Booth was, of course, exactly that, delusional. He conceived of a plot to cut off the head of the American government. If he could kill Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and General Ulysses S. Grant, he believed the ensuing chaos would allow the South to rise from the ashes of defeat. He was, of course, an idiot.
Lincoln would reportedly tell First Lady Mary Lincoln on this day that a few days prior he had had a dream that he was wandering around the executive mansion, now called the White House, when he heard sobbing. As he goes to investigate, people are crying. They claim it's because the president has been killed by an assassin. Lincoln would unfortunately shake this dream off as nothing more than that, a dream.
It is now April 14th, 1865, the day of the assassination. That morning, the Lincolns go for a carriage ride. They discuss the future in an oddly optimistic tone. Abraham discusses plans for after his second term ends. He wishes to travel to Europe, California, and ultimately to return back here to Springfield, Illinois to continue being a lawyer. This is the only evidence we have that he had no designs on pursuing a third term, which was legal at the time. Mary convinces Abraham to take her to the theater that night. In an attempt to make her happy, he reluctantly agrees. At roughly noon, John Wilkes Booth heads to Ford's Theater to collect his mail when he finds out that Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant intend to take in a play called Our American Cousin that night. Booth, who frequently worked at the theater, knew the location well and realized he would largely have unfettered access to it. Booth concluded that tonight was the night. He proceeded to jump up and run away from the theater, a man with a purpose as others would later describe him. 3:30 p.m. here at what used to be the Kirkwood House Hotel and it now is just some kind of building, they had a very special guest. None other than Vice President Andrew Johnson. He was an extreme racist and was only on the Lincoln ticket to try to preserve some measure of political unity. All the same, he found himself to be here at a very unique moment in American history. John Wilkes Booth leaves a note at the hotel for Andrew Johnson that says, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth." The goal was to attempt to implicate Johnson in the impending assassination. It bears repeating, Booth was genuinely crazy. He believed himself to be some divine instrument of the theater. He sees this whole thing as an almost grand performance, one that will cement his legacy forever. Ironically, he is right about that part. That said, in his delusional mind, if he did this, he would free the South from, as he saw it, their oppressor. This can only be described as utterly moronic.
Around 4 p.m., Vice President Andrew Johnson visits the White House to have a meeting with Lincoln. This was only the second time the men had ever met, and the only time they ever discussed policy. Johnson felt the South needed to be punished and advised Lincoln to do so. Lincoln did not agree, Johnson claiming, "We must not be too lenient with traitors."
At the same time, Booth would visit Ford's Theater to make preparations. The presidential suite had 2 entrances. Booth took the time that afternoon to bore a peephole into one of the doors he could later use if needed. He also helped to partially set up a barricade for future use. At around 5 p.m., the Lincoln conspirators, as they're later known, meet for the final time. Though for this plot, far fewer were available. Booth assigns Powell to kill Secretary of State William Seward. Atzerodt is assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Atzerodt showed some reservations, but agreed to comply. Mary Surratt is in attendance, witnesses the events, and even plays a good little hostess to the men. Booth, for his part, being the only famous member and the only one with any reasonable chance of gaining entry to the presidential box, decided he would personally shoot Lincoln with his pistol. He had intended to also stab Grant, but as Grant didn't attend, this proved impossible.
It is now 7 p.m. Abraham Lincoln finishes his dinner and wishes to head out so as not to be late to the play he is to take in with Mrs. Lincoln. He unfortunately tells his bodyguard, William Crook, to take the night off. He even comments, if someone was dedicated enough to kill him, it would be impossible to prevent. This was easily Lincoln's worst decision.
At around 8 p.m., the Lincolns get into a carriage along with Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Miss Clara Harris, who would attend the play as their guests. Lincoln says to Speaker Colfax, "I suppose it's time to go, though I would rather stay." An oddly prophetic statement. General Grant and his wife, Julie Grant, who are both buried in this tomb in New York behind me, were originally set to join the Lincolns instead. However, Mary Lincoln and Julia Grant didn't get along, so Abraham and Ulysses felt it was best to keep them apart. This matters because Grant had been one of Booth's primary targets, but also because Grant wasn't so blasé about security. He would have had the balcony well guarded. Alas, he did not attend. Mary Lincoln wouldn't forget this in future years. At around 8:30 p.m., the Lincolns arrive at Ford's Theater, about a half hour after the show has already begun. Around 9 p.m., the conspirators are getting into position. The plan is to strike just past 10 p.m. in a synchronized effort. Booth enters Ford's Theater. He regularly enters and leaves, getting drinks to keep his energy up and best sync the time. He scopes out the interior several times and knows exactly where Lincoln is, though he realizes Grant is not in attendance and decides to proceed all the same. Booth knew our American cousin extraordinarily well, so much so that he knew the best line in which to fire the fatal shot. In Act 3, Scene 2, the line, "You sockdologizing old man trap," always got the largest laugh. Booth believed if he fired at this exact moment, the laughter may silence his gunshot long enough to give him a chance at escape. To this end, he even hired a boy to wait with his horse outside the theater. Around 9:45 p.m., the show goes into intermission. It's at this time that Lincoln's only bodyguard, one John Parker, who is buried here in an unmarked grave behind me at Glenwood Cemetery in Washington, D.C., would leave his post. He claimed Lincoln told him he could leave, though this wasn't corroborated by Mrs. Lincoln, Clara Harris, or Henry Rathbone. Parker leaves his post and goes to a nearby tavern where he gets drunk and falls asleep. Lincoln is now totally unguarded. At 10 p.m., the lights dim and the show resumes. 5 minutes later, Booth peers into the lobby of Ford's Theater, asking employee John E. Buckingham what the time is. Buckingham directs him to the clock, which reads 10:05. Booth must now get into position. 10:10 p.m., Booth arrives outside the presidential box, surprised to find no guards. He presumes they're inside. Lincoln's valet, a man named Charles Forbes, was, however, sat outside the outer door of the box. Booth notices Forbes and hands him his card. Forbes was never called to testify on the events that night, so we can only guess what was said. The assumption is that Forbes knew Booth as a famous actor. Booth gives him an autographed card and says something to get past the first door. Booth manages to barricade the outer door with a stick-like brace to prevent the possibility of anyone else entering. He then decides to softly and slightly open the inner door, bracing his foot at the edge. The expectation was that his fame would have granted him access to the suite, or at the very least the ability to explain his presence. Anticipating a struggle, he is shocked to find that there is no security detail inside. The attendees, particularly the Lincolns, are so engrossed in the play they simply don't notice Booth's subtle entrance. 10:14 p.m., Booth takes out his Philadelphia Derringer pistol, aiming it point blank at the rear of Abraham Lincoln's head near the left ear. When at 10:15 p.m., he hears the comedic line he was waiting for. Lincoln laughs, as does the audience. At this moment, Booth pulls the trigger. It is said that at least Lincoln went out laughing, as he so rarely got to do. The bullet entered the president's head near the left ear and lodged itself in the front of his skull, passing through his brain. Lincoln slumps and falls into the back of his chair while there are screams and gasps. The laughter has instantly ended. Major Rathbone attempts to tackle Booth, causing him to drop his pistol, but is sliced by the knife Booth had intended to kill Grant with. Booth decides to jump off the balcony onto the stage. His boot spurs get caught on the draped American flag, fittingly, causing him to lose balance and land awkwardly. This likely caused his leg to break. Once on stage, while wielding the bloody knife he had just used, Booth screams, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning thus always to tyrants, or the South is avenged. History disputes which was actually said. In any event, Booth then hobbles to the rear exit of the theater where a man named William Withers attempts to stop him. Booth, still brandishing the knife, slashes at Withers. He gets outside and makes it to his horse. At the exact same time at the Kirkwood House Hotel, would-be assassin George Atzerodt is one floor above Vice President Andrew Johnson. He is to go downstairs, knock on his door, and stab him through the heart with a knife when he answers. Atzerodt, who had qualms about this plan to begin with, ultimately chooses to take no action. Andrew Johnson would survive unharmed. Also at 10:15 p.m., Lewis Powell arrives here at what is now the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. He breaks into what was William Seward's home and stabs 5 different people in the house looking for Seward. Once found, Powell stabs Seward 5 times. He leaves believing the man to be dead. Ironically, the reason he had been in bed is he had been recovering from a recent carriage accident and was wearing a metal brace. Said metal brace had largely shielded Seward's body, as it would ultimately turn out. Only minutes after all of this, Dr. Charles Leal is granted access to the box to examine the president when Rathbone removes the barricade placed by Booth. Lincoln at this point was still alive, but Leal had the unfortunate duty to declare the wound was fatal. Despite this, Lincoln continued to breathe. It was decided to give the president any chance of survival or to die with dignity, he'd have to be moved. Getting him to the White House was unrealistic, so he was moved across the street to the Peterson House. Soldiers would carry him there in the rain. At around 10:30 p.m., a man named Leonard J. Farwell, who had witnessed the shooting, feared for Andrew Johnson's life and ran to the Kirkwood House Hotel with guards to protect the vice president, soon to be president of the United States. He informed Johnson of the assassination. Johnson, despite his questionable morality, was ultimately loyal to the President of the United States of America. He went henceforth to the Peterson home to see Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was taken up the stairs and into the only unoccupied room, then placed on a bed he was far too tall for, causing him to be positioned diagonally. He would then be stripped down to search for any additional wounds. When none were discovered, he was given garbs to grant him his dignity. At around the same time, John Wilkes Booth reaches the Navy Yard Bridge leading from D.C. into Maryland. The bridge is guarded, and he is stopped by a man named Silas T. Cobb, who informs him the bridge is closed and asks his name. Booth boldly and proudly responds, "John Wilkes Booth." Cobb ends up allowing Booth to cross, a decision he'd regret. Over the course of the night, many things happened. It was agreed by all parties that Lincoln would not survive, and that the whole endeavor had been a conspiracy. Not knowing the depths of it yet, Secretary of War Edward M. Stanton was granted the temporary powers of the presidency to keep the government operational and to begin the process of investigating what had occurred. It was unknown. Why had this happened? How did it go? Was this an official act of the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis? Would this mean war resumes in full? How would the Union respond to such a barbaric and hostile act? Lincoln, for his part, had wanted a peaceful reunification with the South, and for their part, the South had murdered him. This would add fuel to the notion that the North should not simply let the South peacefully reunify, but to instead get revenge for the whole conflict. At this point, there were too many unknowns. At 11 p.m., Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son, would be granted access to see his father. His younger brother Tad had been denied entry. Tad had actually been watching a play at the time of the shooting and was informed of his father's assassination when the play was interrupted to report the news to the audience. At around 11:30 p.m., John Wilkes Booth regroups with David Harold, another conspirator. They arrive at the Surratt Tavern here in what is now Clinton, Maryland. A man named Lloyd hands them their weapons they had intended to pick up before heading further south. Booth proudly tells him that he killed the president. Lloyd would later claim he wanted to shoot Booth right there and then, but additional evidence suggests he was likely highly intoxicated that night and probably shrugged Booth's comments off before ultimately falling asleep. It is now April 15th, 1865, the final day of Abraham Lincoln's life, and henceforth one day after the assassination. At 4 a.m. in Charles County, Maryland, Booth and Harold arrived here at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd decided to provide them shelter for the night and set Booth's leg to help him heal. He was a Confederate sympathizer. He knew who Booth was, but didn't yet know of the assassination. Would he have behaved differently if he had? That's been the debate for years. The decision to aid Booth would define and ultimately destroy his life. Expressions such as "your name is Mudd" or "dragged your name through mud" get their origin in this event. Meanwhile, at the Kirkwood House Hotel, Vice President Andrew Johnson was under guard and was heard to be pacing around his room muttering, "They shall suffer for this. They shall suffer for this." In Johnson's mind, he had warned Lincoln not to be so lenient, and felt this was exactly why. That night, little to no thought was given to securing evidence or history. Ford's Theater was full of would-be trophy hunters, including things like the flag Booth had been caught on, his gun, the barricade, and even this, the actual chair Lincoln was shot in. Items like this would take years, if not decades, to recover and archive. Over the course of the night, the president's breathing slowed. His body grew colder, his heartbeat weaker. At 7 a.m., Mary Lincoln was granted access to pay her last respects to her husband for the final time before being removed shortly after. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, who had led the country through the greatest political divide and most horrible war in its history then and now, passed away. His death transformed him from a mere unpopular but necessary president into a martyr that had gloriously died to preserve democracy, freedom, and the opportunities of all peoples that call the United States their home to have equal rights, liberties, and freedoms under the inalienable benefit granted to them simply by harboring the title American citizen.
Acting President Edwin M. Stanton would famously say, "Now he belongs to the angels," though he'd later revise this to, "Now he belongs to the ages." History, however, disputes if he ever actually said this that morning.
It must be said that this was the first presidential assassination in American history, and thus there was no clear precedent on how the succession of power worked. Today, we popularly believe the job automatically falls to the vice president, though technically this is incorrect.
The Founding Fathers, represented here by Independence Hall behind me, had intended that were a president to die in office for any reason, a new election would be held. In the interim, the vice president would merely be the acting president. However, when William Henry Harrison, the 9th president of the United States, had died only 32 days into office, his vice president, John Tyler, had essentially declared that since we had just had an election, it was silly to do another one so quickly. Rather, he would simply assume the presidency to complete the term. This would continue when Millard Fillmore would finish the term of Zachary Taylor, when he too died in office only a year into his presidency.
Keep in mind, Lincoln died only 43 days into his second term. Thus, the same mentality meant that since they too had only recently held an election, that it was likely best Andrew Johnson simply complete Lincoln's term.
Had the assassination happened perhaps a year later, they and future generations may have complied with the founders' original intentions on the presidential line of succession. Andrew Johnson, who's buried behind me here in Greenville, Tennessee, for all his many, many faults, even he wasn't sure he was supposed to be president. He was an unliked outsider. He was only on the Lincoln ticket as he was the only senator from a secessionist state to stay with the Union. He wasn't even the same political party as Lincoln. Lincoln had run his first term as a Republican, while Johnson had been a Democrat. They worked together as the Civil Union Party for the 1864 election, but aside from agreeing on preserving the Union, they couldn't have been more different. Johnson, oddly enough, gives the cabinet of the president the opportunity to vote on what should happen. They all place names to paper to decide who should be president. The decision is made. It would be best, they all feel, for the sake of continuity, if Andrew Johnson is sworn in as the 17th President of the United States, which happens at 10 a.m., April 15th, 1865, here at what used to be the Kirkwood House Hotel.
That day, Dr. Mudd is in town performing several errands when he is informed John Wilkes Booth is the one wanted for murder of the president. Fearful for his family's safety, he opts not to tell anyone and returns home. Once he arrives, Booth and Harold were already leaving the Mudd residence, heading south. With evening approaching, Mudd decides to remain home to safeguard his family as he saw it, rather than report what had happened. It would cost him dearly.
It is now April 16th, 1865, 2 days after the assassination. While many mourn Lincoln, privately there are many that are quite happy. As I said, Lincoln wasn't popular in his time. It was felt by many the South must be punished, a sentiment that Lincoln had opposed, but Johnson very much supported. Jefferson Davis, who is buried here behind me, and his cabinet are on the run in North Carolina. However, they were unable to find anyone to take them in. Even in the South, he is seen as the man who caused all of this.
Across the country, people's mourning turned to anger as they sought retribution against the perceived actions of the South. This got so bad that former presidents Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce were sent threatening messages for not saying or doing anything to mourn the loss publicly. Meanwhile, the family of Booth had their lives destroyed. This prestigious thespian family, now forever associated with the assassination, their careers and lives ruined, though little sympathy was felt for they had helped raise and house a monster. John Wilkes Booth and David Harold remained camped out on the run, looking for an opportunity to cross the Potomac River and head further south into Virginia through the Sakaya Swamp to find a man named Samuel Cox.
It is now April 17th, 1865, 3 days after the assassination.
Union troops reach the Surratt house and investigate. They interrogate Mary Surratt, who denied any knowledge of anything. As dumb luck would have it, who walks in and denies this but one Lewis Powell, the man who had attempted to kill William Seward. He was promptly arrested, as was Mary.
Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston is set to meet with Union General William Sherman in North Carolina to discuss his formal surrender, represented here by Appomattox Courthouse, which, yes, I know is not where they met. At this meeting, he is informed of the death of Lincoln and becomes very agitated. He now realizes he may not be granted the same peaceful terms Robert E. Lee had.
It's difficult to express how much damage Booth really did to the Reconstruction effort of the South. Even to those who this very day, for whatever small-minded reason, believe Lincoln's death was good for the South, were apparently unable to understand the basic reality that Lincoln solely sought to unify the people around the core foundation of the American Republic.
freedom, liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. The death of Lincoln set the South back more than a century in that effort. Anyone out there that still, for whatever reason, agrees that Lincoln's death was in some way good for the South is plainly put a moron. So naturally, this would include John Wilkes Booth, one of the stupidest people in the history of the American experiment.
It must be stressed that at this point, tensions were extremely high. The Union now seeks revenge, and the South, particularly Jefferson Davis, wishes to encourage a guerrilla warfare campaign against the Union. Such an action would have been years, if not decades, of turmoil and death for everyone. The man who largely prevented this was Robert E. Lee, who told the South to stand down, go home, and in a sense became the voice for Lincoln. He is buried here behind me in Lexington, Virginia. While it's impossible to agree with Lee for joining the war effort at all, I do respect him for how he accepted defeat and spared perhaps generations from continued pain. He would say, "I surrendered as much to Lincoln's goodness as his armies." Lincoln knew an absence of retaliation was the best medicine for an ailing nation. Robert E. Lee is often remembered similarly to Japan's Emperor Hirohito from World War II, who is buried here behind me. Instrumental in a war he didn't want, and largely the reason peace and reconstruction would prove possible because he had the courage to accept defeat and that times were changing. Andrew Johnson had intended to override Lincoln's wishes now that he was president and have many of the Southern generals, including Lee, hung. It was Ulysses S. Grant that managed to step in and convince Johnson to do otherwise. Please understand that in the history of the world, civil wars don't often end so cleanly. Take North and South Korea, for example. But that's a story for another time, perhaps.
It is now April 18th, 1865, 4 days after the assassination.
Booth and Harold are discovered the next morning by Thomas Jones, a Confederate agent through the aid of Samuel Cox, who once lived here right outside the Sakai Swamp. He tells them to remain. Union troops are now pursuing them in the largest manhunt in the history of the country. Hiding was their only chance at escape. To this end, they couldn't even light a fire for fear of being noticed. They actually escorted their horses to a swamp and shot them so as to drown them in the mud and prevent possible noise from being perceived by Union forces. Booth requests newspapers from Thomas Jones. He needs to know how the world rejoices at what he's done. He is overwhelmingly shocked to find out that all walks of life, Northern, Southern, Union, Confederate, Republican, Democrat, military, civilian, American, and foreign, are all enraged by his actions, calling for him to be hung for the idiotic, cowardly, opportunistic vermin that he was. Booth had been adamant that his actions would make him a hero. Now he recognized that his people, as he saw it, had betrayed him. Though it would be more accurate to say that he was the only one too stupid to recognize that what he did was the worst action anyone could have taken. However, it's clear he wasn't self-aware enough or intelligent enough to recognize his mistake. At this time, he begins writing a manifesto of his actions, defending himself as the hero of the story who defiantly slaughtered the oppressor. All the same, he was wrong, and shockingly incompetent. Though I do credit him with this. Thanks to this decision to write down his thoughts, we have an astonishingly good account for what this demonstrable troglodyte actually thought.
It is now April 19th, 1865, 5 days after the assassination.
Today is the state funeral of Abraham Lincoln. To this end, a special catafalque created for the purposes of supporting Lincoln's casket was created. This object remains in use for state funerals to this day. It, as well as the casket of the slain president, are brought to the east room of the White House for those present to mourn.
At 2 p.m., the casket is moved to a funeral carriage and taken to the Capitol building rotunda for everyone to pay respects to the fallen president. This tradition lives on today.
It is now April 20th, 1865, 6 days after the assassination.
George Atzerodt was staying at the home of Hartman Richter, which is now something called the Maryland Soccerplex, when he and his other conspirators were arrested, save for Booth and Harold. The U.S. government would even put out a $100,000 reward for information leading to their capture. Atzerodt in particular was caught simply because he had bragged he was supposed to be the guy to kill Andrew Johnson. As I said, this wasn't a bright group of people.
It is now April 21st, 1865, 7 days after the assassination.
Lincoln's body, along with that of his recently disinterred son, Willie Lincoln, are placed on a train with the aim of stopping around the country for citizens to mourn and say goodbye, and ultimately arrive here in Springfield, Illinois for burial. Mary Lincoln does not join him. It is said that this mobile funeral wasn't merely for their slain president. It was an opportunity for the American people to mourn the war and all it had taken from them. Lincoln became emblematic of that loss, and his sacrifice made him a hero who fought for all of them.
That night, Thomas Jones escorts Booth and Harold to the Potomac River, gives them a boat, directions, and sets them on their way into Virginia, where they believe they'll be greeted as heroes. The idea is that in a broken South, full of sympathizers, it would be easy for Booth to discreetly fit himself into society, even if his dreams of being celebrated as a hero are impossible. To this end, all they had to do was row south, following the compass and instructions given to them. However, what did I say before? These guys were idiots. They end up rowing northwest, right back into Maryland.
It is now April 24th, 1865, 10 days after the assassination.
The Union manhunt persists. A woman reports she saw 3 Confederate troops escort 2 men here into Virginia after they crossed the Potomac River behind me. One of these men had a broken leg, as Booth was known to have had. At this point, very few were willing to help Booth. Even most Southerners recognized what he had done was unforgivable. Booth reaches a point where he starts threatening violence to those who won't assist him. Yeah, what a hero of the people. One of the aforementioned Confederate troops, named Willie Jett, was genuinely starstruck by Booth and what he'd done. So much so that he wants to hear the story from Booth's perspective. Booth, who had been ever the performer, proud of what he'd done, eager to be the hero, wanting all to know his name and his deed, is so beaten down by the reality of his actions, all he can say is, nothing to brag about. Perhaps the best evidence we have that even this dull-witted oaf that was Booth had finally realized he was in the wrong. Booth and Harold find refuge in a tobacco farm that once existed here, owned by a man named Richard Garrett in Caroline County, Virginia. They had been introduced as Confederate soldiers back from the war by these same three men. Garrett hadn't heard of the assassination, and Booth was using an alias, a far cry from 10 days earlier when he proudly told a Union soldier he was John Wilkes Booth. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis tells Joseph E. Johnston of the Confederate Army to ignore any peace deals and fight on. Johnston, summoning the same moral courage as Robert E. Lee, recognizes this wasn't the way. While he'd have to accept that it meant their sacrifice had been for naught, that so many had died for no reason, and that their dream of Southern independence had to end, it was still the correct thing to do. He may have not recognized the Confederacy for the abject evil institution that it was, but he did recognize it could not prevail. It was best to end hostilities rather than subject people to more suffering, all in the name of nothing.
It's now April 25th, 1865, 11 days after the assassination.
Booth began to unwind and relax, feeling this had meant he had escaped into Southern life. He would be a free man in his ignorant mind. Though during the day Union troops would pass by the farm, Booth and Harold would become erratic and let slip things that had made Garrett suspicious, particularly that their horses would be stolen. As a result, Garrett gets Booth and Harold to spend the night in the barn. Without their knowledge, one of Garrett's sons locked them into the barn. They were now unable to leave. Union troops continue their investigation and discover the location of Willie Jett, the man who had escorted Booth to the Garrett farm. He is found and interrogated. He reluctantly informs them of Booth's whereabouts.
It is now April 26th, 1865, 12 days after the assassination.
At around 2 a.m., Union troops reached the Garrett farm. Richard Garrett, for whatever reason, refused to give up Booth's position. However, Garrett's son was quite willing to tell Union troops that he was in the barn. Upon seeing this, David Harold almost immediately emerges and surrenders. John Wilkes Booth, on the other hand, did not comply. He reportedly yells, "Well, my brave boys, prepare a stretcher for me," and a standoff ensues. Union troops set the barn on fire, hoping to get Booth to come out on his own. While Booth is distracted, a soldier named Boston Corbett fires on him, despite orders to take him alive. The bullet severs his spinal cord, rendering him paralyzed. He is dragged out by Union troops and examined by a doctor, who declares the wound is fatal. He would be laid out, incapacitated, struggling to breathe, slowly growing colder and weaker, not all too unlike the president that he had just killed. A few hours later, Booth, barely able to speak, unable to move, requests to see his hands. Union troops move them into his view. He says, "Useless, useless," then dies a little after 7 a.m., fittingly around the same time Lincoln had died. It was also his 27th birthday. The following day, news of his death would reach the wider world to much applause and praise. The once respected actor, now an astonishingly barbaric and utterly idiotic monster, was dead. Seriously, this guy.
It is now May 3rd, 1865, 19 days after the assassination.
Abraham Lincoln's body arrives here in Springfield, Illinois, and is placed inside the Capitol building for one night. The same location he had once famously said, "A house divided among itself cannot stand." He was to be buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery nearby in compliance with the wishes of Mary Lincoln. However, due to concerns over the grave, the type of tomb, and more, Lincoln's body would be moved several times, and ultimately he would finally rest in the Lincoln tomb on June 17th, 1931, over 66 years after the assassination. Then President Herbert Hoover would attend to formally unveil it to the public. May 10th, 1865, Jefferson Davis is captured by Union troops while in disguise wearing a dress in an attempt to hide. History doesn't look back kindly on this cowardly man that had fled and fled, telling others to continue to fight a war for him guerrilla style. All the same, the last remnant of the Confederate government was now dissolved. On May 12th, the rest of the Lincoln conspirators were put on trial. All were found guilty. They'd be brought to the old Arsenal Penitentiary, which once stood here and is now a soccer stadium where the team DC United plays. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were put to death on July 7th. They were not told they were to be executed until the night of July 6th. The other four, Michael O'Laughlin, Edmund Spangler, Samuel Mudd, and Samuel Arnold, all received life in prison, though Michael O'Laughlin would die from yellow fever in 1867. The other three were pardoned by Andrew Johnson on his final days in office in 1869. So next time you come out here to see a DC United game, just remember, the Lincoln conspirators died in there. May 13th, 1865, the final battle of the Civil War is fought at Palmito Ranch, Texas, where word of the end of the war has not yet reached. The great irony is the Confederates win the battle to a war that is already over. The last victim of the Civil War was that of John J. Williams of the Union Army, a senseless death in a needless battle in a stupid war that only happened because stubborn and ignorant men couldn't accept the very notion of change, freedom, patriotism, and the future.
May 22nd, 1865. Believe it or not, President Johnson had allowed Mary Lincoln to live in the White House for over a month after the death of Abraham. Similarly, President Lyndon Johnson would allow Jackie Kennedy to remain in the White House sometime after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, nearly a century later.
May 26th, 1865. General Kirby of the Confederate Army formally surrenders at a ceremony in New Orleans. The war is over. December of 1865, President Andrew Johnson declares Reconstruction complete and effectively leaves the black population of the South to fend for itself. He simply didn't recognize that the country had changed. While he made no attempt to restart slavery, he did believe, let's just say, some extremely racist things.
Had Lincoln not died, he likely would have handled Reconstruction and the rights of African Americans far better. It's possible that had it not been for John Wilkes Booth, there may never have been a need for a civil rights movement nearly a century later. History works slowly. It's part of the same American experiment Lincoln was so fond of. However, in this case, Booth didn't just slow down the progress of African Americans. He altered the course of world history in all the wrong ways. He is now remembered largely as a small-minded, idiotic, racist man and a monster. Booth would initially be buried at a federal prison in Washington, D.C. Later, he was dug up and moved to an unmarked grave in the Booth family plot in Baltimore, Maryland. Rumors would swirl for decades that he had survived, such as a story in 1877 in Granbury, Texas, of a supposedly dying man named John St. Helen who would tell one Finis L. Bates, oddly enough the grandfather of Academy Award winner Kathy Bates, he was John Wilkes Booth. He claimed Andrew Johnson had paid him to do this, and the man known to be the real Booth was, of course, an imposter. St. Helen would suddenly vanish after telling the story. In 1903, now under the name David E. George, while living in Enid, Oklahoma, he told the same story of being John Wilkes Booth. He then committed suicide. Bates, as coincidence would have it, saw the article and remembered the story St. Helen had told him 36 years prior. Upon realizing this, Bates made his way to Enid and gained custody of the body, where he placed it into a carnival as the mummified body of John Wilkes Booth. The corpse would do the rounds across the U.S. and fall into many different hands, last seen publicly in the 1970s. Its current whereabouts are unknown, but believed to be in the possession of a private collector. While this story is absurd, Booth had organized an assassination against an American president and succeeded to an extent. Despite the overall plot failing and not being completely carried out, after this point it would become commonplace to consider these assassins to be involved in larger plots instead of the simple truth. They're unstable, depraved men seeking fame, fortune, revenge as they saw it, and more. One of the many sins Booth committed was forcing onto American society to endure the notion that a conspiracy was always responsible for the actions of an individual, such as Lee Harvey Oswald, right here nearly a century later. Unfortunately, one of the enduring legacies of Booth's actions is that it convinced future generations in the power of the grand conspiracy. Many found it almost impossible to accept that their mighty president could have been so easily taken from them by essentially one man. Booth had fundamentally altered the American psyche to a state of denial of simple truth. How could Booth, too, have been so easily found, killed, and buried in a pauper's grave? An unwillingness to accept basic elements of reality would permeate into future generations, many opting to believe lies, for the simplicity of the truth was harder to accept. In the wake of the shooting, Ford's theater owner John Ford would shut down his theater. Eventually, it would become a museum and a historical record to the events 160 years ago that so changed the nation. And oddly enough, is still an active theater. Like, we just found that one out. That was kind of cool. In 1887, Boston Corbett, the man who shot John Wilkes Booth here at what was once the Garrett Farm, was placed into an insane asylum in Kansas. He escaped a year later and was never seen from or heard from again. Edwin M. Stanton would go on to be placed on the Supreme Court in 1869. Unfortunately, he would pass away before he could ever serve on the court. Secretary of State William Seward would survive his assault and get back to work. He is best known for the purchase of Alaska from the Russians in 1867. He would die 5 years later in 1872. Andrew Johnson would go on to be one of the worst presidents in American history, and was even the first to be impeached, though he wasn't removed from office. He was unable to stand any chance at re-election, though he became the only former president to win a U.S. Senate seat. Ulysses S. Grant would win the 1868 election and become the 18th president of the United States, serving 2 terms. Initially, the Civil War hero from Illinois was seen as Lincoln's true unfinished presidency, though this wouldn't hold. He would leave office as a rather unpopular president, but remained the great general. Mary Lincoln, consumed with grief over encouraging Abraham to attend Ford's theater, as well as effectively barring the Grants from attending the play that may have spared her husband's life, would move briefly to Chicago and stay here at the Tremont Studios Hotel after the assassination. She would continue to bounce around the country for a number of years. In 1871, her son Tad Lincoln died.
She would further lose her grasp on reality and was briefly placed in an asylum here in Batavia, Illinois called Bellevue Place by her only surviving son, Robert Lincoln, in 1875, after which time she refused to speak to him again and moved to Europe for a few years. She'd returned to Springfield a mentally broken and exhausted woman. All her worst fears come to pass, largely forgotten by the country, always living in the shadow of the legacy of her husband. She would die on July 16, 1882, and finally allowed to rest near her husband. It is believed that she had never visited his grave and had not seen his remains since the assassination.
Robert Lincoln would be the only child of the Lincolns to survive his parents. Alas, he had no children and thus passed on no lineage of the Lincoln family to continue to influence that greatness that is the Union. He is buried here at Arlington Cemetery.
Abraham Lincoln himself would be remembered as one of, if not the greatest president in American history. He is perhaps the most famous American to have ever lived, known the world over even today. His efforts and sacrifice as a simple country boy who believed in that great American experiment thrust him to greatness. That greatness would take his life, but it would better all of ours. He was not merely the great emancipator. He is also a model for the very principles the United States was founded on. He embodied completely and totally the very idea that this country truly is one of the people, for the people, by the people, and of the people. It is the duty of those very people to honor, serve, and protect that union from any threat, foreign or domestic. Lincoln exhibits to us the very best of what we can be, the very sacrifice that can often be needed, and the struggles it can take to preserve the basic principle that is freedom. Today, save for Robert Lincoln, you can pay your respects to this incredible American family right here in Springfield, Illinois.
And that'll do it. As you can imagine, this video was a ton of effort. I hope you guys liked it and you really appreciate it. If you did, there's going to be various financial links in the description, things like PayPal, etc. I would really appreciate the support, and that lets me know you want me to keep making videos with this much effort, because I really did go to all these places, and as you can imagine, that was quite difficult. I do want to give a shout out here, though, to at least some of the people who helped make that a little bit easier. People like Joseph the Hard Off Destroyer, Brett, Rob Thanos, Megalink, Snowman, and of course Sunshine. He was there for half the video. They made the ground game part of this a little bit easier. So again, if you can consider contributing to the channel financially, I appreciate that. If not, at the very least, if you could like the video, comment down below, and subscribe, I appreciate that as well. Social media support, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Spreadshirt, etc. It's all in there. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all later.